guess we should get started. Thank you everyone for coming. The Center for Latin American Studies Brazil Working Group, co-sponsored by Lucia Costicon and myself, as well as the Department of Political Science, are delighted to welcome Professor Wendy Hunter from the University of Texas, Austin. She's a Berkeley PhD and is a professor of comparative politics and political science there. Has done work extensively on the military in Brazil and more recently on left parties in Latin America and on social policies in Brazil, and most recently is the author of The Transformation of the Workers' Party in Brazil, 1989 to 2009 at Cambridge University Press, as well as many, many scholarly articles and works. I'll turn over the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, nice to see everybody, including my old undergraduate student here. This is my first time at Ohio State, so I'm very impressed with the place and I'm glad to be here. I'm going to talk today on research that I'm only beginning, that really has a development focus, but it also really has a comparative politics focus. In comparative politics, I don't think we have spent enough time on questions like this, and when I looked for literature, it's very actually hard to find literature on this. So I do think that it marries some development issues and issues in social policy or comparative politics. And that's the issue of people who lack documents in a middle-income country like Brazil. And it turns out that if you lack documents, so I'm talking about documents like, beginning with the birth certificate. The birth certificate is the stepping stone to getting anything else. CPF, RG, título de eleitor. If you don't have a birth certificate, you are going nowhere in life. You cannot get your social security document. You cannot get a document, carteira assinada, that gives you labor protection. And in the days of old, this was necessary to get into the Previdencia system or Social Security. Without a birth certificate, you cannot legally die, so you can't get a death certificate. If you don't have a death certificate, your family cannot ask for funeral assistance. You cannot be buried in some cemeteries. Now, the sad nature of path dependency is such that if your parents did not have a birth certificate, neither can you get one, because your parents don't have an identity, so you don't have an identity. So it really is been tragic for people who don't have these documents. In the modern era, with many individual entitlements, like conditional cash transfers, like non-contributory pensions, you cannot access these programs. You cannot gain access to them without the essential documentation, beginning with the birth certificate. So these are really essential to citizenship. Before going on, I also want to mention that in the international arena, if you should ever be the subject of sex trafficking or human trafficking, it would be a very good idea to have an identity document in some nation state. So this is increasingly recognized as a problem for folks who study international trafficking of people, much less refugee-type situations. The other modern issue at hand here is you cannot get any credit if you don't have an identity, or what bank is going to lend you money. So you really are excluded from the rights of modern citizenship if you don't have documentation. In this country, I think we focus a lot on the negatives of documentation, but here in this presentation, I really want to focus on how documents confer rights. They gave you access to entitlements that are already there, but which you cannot have if you cannot prove who you are. In short, the state does not know you exist if you do not have a birth certificate. And in the development community, people are really starting to recognize this. UNICEF, for instance, has, as part of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Children, that all children are entitled to a name and a last name. There's a big push in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in many of the highly indigenous countries in Latin America to get kids a birth certificate. In a country like Bangladesh, 80% of all children do not even have a birth certificate. So this is really getting out there in the international community. The World Bank recognizes the lack of documentation of people as an incredibly important problem. In the Voices of the Poor, they talk about this. James Scott, in the book Seeing Like a State, there's a whole section on how modern states want to see people. They want to count. They want to make everyone count. They want to map the population. And you see this kind of discourse also coming out of the technocrats in Brasilia. Like, how can a modern country not know who's in it? So their vision is very technocratic. Turns out the infant mortality figures are off in the Northeast because a bunch of children died, but the IBGE, the Census Bureau, never knew they died because their parents never had birth certificates, so they didn't get them death certificates, so there are these illegal cemeteries they found. So there's a technocratic interest in this too, not just a humanitarian one. Lastly, how do we know that this is a problem? Any decent social worker in one of these countries that I mentioned, including Brazil, knows that one of the obstacles to poor people basically getting the rights that they theoretically have is to get documentation. So documents are central. There's a pervasive under-registration in the world, but even in a middle-income country like Brazil. However, this has started to change. We see in many Latin American countries, including Brazil, this recent mobilization of poor families finally getting documented. Now the focus is on the children, because many of the new individual entitlements go towards the children. However, in a world where there are many emerging non-contributory tensions, you have to also be able to show who you are. And so 65-year-old women who live in the outer reaches of many Latin American countries don't even have a birth certificate, and therefore they cannot get their old age pension. So we see what we call a whole phenomena of late registration. People trying to prove that they were born 70 years ago, and all they have is a baptism document. And thank goodness they have that, or else they would go nowhere in this quest for late registration. So my question here is, what accounts for this recent drive? I just want to, before I do that, I want to show you the figures on the fact that there is been a very dramatic decline in the undocumented. So the subregistro is just a figure that shows the difference between the number of people being born, which they can establish fairly well, given that 98% of all Brazilian children are born in some kind of clinic now, versus the number of people that don't get documents. So in 1998, the figure was as high as 27%. This is a national average, so you can only imagine what it is like in the Northeast and the Amazon. And there's been a real campaign underway to bring the number of kids without documents down. Now, if we included the old age population in this, because this is just the difference between births in 1998 and kids who didn't get documents, you would see this number really be much bigger. But my point is that there's a decline. So the question is, what's going on in Brazil and in elsewhere to cause such a steep decline? To understand why there was pervasive under-registration, though, I think it's first important to go back to, to understand why the change, I think it's first important to go back to why this has been such a problem. And the first four of these are fairly straightforward, kind of logistical problems that folks have identified. And my contribution is to focus on the fifth one of these here and show that, in fact, historically, there wasn't enough of an immediate, urgent incentive in the eyes of many poor marginal citizens to actually overcome these first four problems. So let me briefly go through what these problems are, and then talk about what I think is the important political or social policy issue here. Brazil has been a country of high infant mortality rates. As late as the 1960s, 1 in every 10 Brazilian children, so the infant mortality rate was about 10%. And that has been especially marked in certain areas of the country. If you have read Nancy Shepherd Hughes' Death Without Weeping, which is just heart-wrenching anthropological study of the Northeast, you know that people just didn't invest in their children if they thought they were gonna stand a fair chance of dying by the first year of their life. As late as the 1990s in the Northeast, there were 64 infant deaths per 1,000 live births, so in the northeast of the country. That is still very high. That is on par with some African countries. And so if you're gonna have to pay for this and undergo a great cost and travel a great distance, and there's this high infant mortality lurking in the background, that really was a disincentive to getting kids documented. The cost was also a factor. The way this worked before the reforms of the Fernando Henrique Cardoso era with these cartorios, which are notary publics, they had almost an iron grip on how much they charged people for birth certificates. And in some states, to get your child a birth certificate was 1/3 of a monthly minimum wage, which is absolutely criminal. And so you can imagine that, especially if you had high infant mortality, this was a very high cost for people who didn't quite see an immediate need for it. In the long run, all kids are better with a birth certificate than without, but without just an immediate program like the Bolsa Familia at hand, people just didn't think that the cost was worth it. Distance is also a factor. In some large states, there are not many cartorios, not many notary publics, and that's how you had to actually go and register your child. This is a no-brainer to me. If there are not many notary publics, well, get some documentation going within the clinics. Bring the state to the births, rather than having poor marginalized people have to travel 200 kilometers in, states like Pará and Maranhão to get their kids documented. There's politics behind this, though, because these notary publics make money, and they make themselves scarce, and you need judges to sign off on the creation of new notary publics. So you can imagine the monopoly and the money transfers that go through to keep this a very scarce resource. The other real issue was paternity. In the days of old, so this legislation has evolved, but you needed a father's name on the birth certificate. If you look at your own birth certificate, it probably says, I went back and looked at my kids, it says father and mother. And many fathers were not assuming paternity and not showing up at the clinic, and there was really, at first, there was no way out. You had to have a father's name on that birth certificate. Then they relaxed the laws a little bit, such that the mother's name only could appear. However, there's a social stigma with this. So many mothers just waited and waited and waited for the father to assume paternity. It didn't happen, and there's a rule of thumb here. If your kid does not get a birth certificate in roughly the first 60 days after birth, chances are that child will remain undocumented. It's one of these things, if you look at it statistically, either they get it early or they're probably going to be undocumented. And that was the case until you had some social programs that gave a huge incentive for children to get documented, children and old people. So what I'm focusing on here is really a shift in social policy. And I think it's this shift in social policy that has caused this change. So I'm going to give you my explanation in a minute, but I just want to show you the geography of this. So this is how many kids births get registered within 90 days. And you can see that in the most developed areas of Brazil, it's between 90% and 100. But the more remote you go, the less likely it is that you will see children receiving birth certificates within the first 90 days of their birth. Okay, so stepping back here, my interest is in social policy and how that has shifted over time. And so this relates to number 5, that there was a paucity of social programs that required documentation, and now this is the new wave of social policy. Individual means-tested entitlements that do not operate through patronage. Patronage politicians do not want identity documents because they get in the way of discretion. And so both the new push towards documentation both reflects a decline of patronage social policy, but I also think it contributes or reinforces that decline. So let's step back now and look at how this operated in the days of old. The ISI citizenship regime, so when Brazil was following the Getulio Vargas mode of answering the social question under import substitution, industrialization, it was the military, it was civil servants, and it was the organized working class in the formal sector, the people who could make trouble if you allowed them to develop autonomously, that were given the ticket to citizenship, and that was the carteira assinada, the work permit. This gave these folks not only protection under Brazilian labor law, but it gave them the right to a pension at the end of their life. So these are these regressive old age pensions that the social policy world talks about. And so being a formal sector worker was everything, and your life was not bad if you were one. And these people had documents, and so if you look in the, sort of punctuated, in the period of Getulio Vargas, a lot of people who fit that bill get documented, and then they have these rights. Vanderlei Guillermo dos Santos calls this regulated citizenship. All rights to a few people in exchange for these rights, be quiet and don't oppose the regime. But the problem was, most people did not fall under these categories. Rural workers did not fall under the category of carteira assinada folks. A huge group that was left excluded was poor women, especially in rural areas. Poor kids whose parents were in the informal sector. And so this was a very elite model of addressing the social question, and that came out of the Estado Novo period. There was a brief moment under the military regime where the military, as they made the transition, so this is Ernesto Geisel in the mid-70s, extended a Previdencia program, a social security program, to the countryside to cover workers that did not fall under the kind of elite aristocracy of labor. However, and that did require that you prove who you were. Unfortunately, that also required you to show how long you worked, where you worked, what your contributions were, and a lot of that got mixed up in political patronage. And it's not unimaginable that there were politics in that, because the military was basically trying to build support for their pro-government party, Arena, by instituting this program. So many people who have studied this closely say that this was also kind of part of the patronage regime. And again, the problem is a lot of people were left out of it. However, the debt crisis came along, and so now I'm trying to explain the shift out of this. And the debt crisis, early 80s, Brazil stabilizes the government in the 1990s, stabilizes the economy, and really makes a shift, at least a partial shift, in social policy towards a more targeted social policy, targeted on poor people. I would say this is very neoliberal in that it goes towards individuals, not collectivities. It's very means tested. You have to be below a certain income to get it. You have to show a bunch of things, including documents. The idea here was to use money effectively and efficiently. And rather than having kind of aristocracy of people within the ISI Vargas social policy regime, the idea was to create a minimum floor below which even the most indigent Brazilian would not fall. And so there really was a shift here. Not that those old age pensions that are regressive were pulled away, but I would say this was added to the social policy picture. And if you talk to people like José Serra, who was in the Ministry of Health, some of the high technocrats, the way they talk about it is interesting. The discourse is, this is a middle income country. It is embarrassing that we have, embarrassing and unacceptable, that we have such marginality. Through not that much money, Bolsa Familia, BPC, which is this non-contributory old age pension, we can start addressing these problems. But we need to overhaul the system so that these individual entitlements just don't end up in a big bunch of corruption, fraud, and more political patronage. So there really was a shift in thinking here towards more targeting, towards individuals, towards means testing, towards a more bureaucratic and not discretionary patronage regime. That really shifts in the 1990s. And what we see now is what some people call a more universal model. It is more universal in that poor, marginal people are getting covered, so more Brazilians are getting covered. However, it is highly targeted in that the money for these two programs goes towards people who are truly, truly poor, and they need to prove they are poor. So my argument is this kind of shift towards mobilization of documentation is state-driven. This is technocratic. There's a shift in social policy. It creates a demand from society for documents, but the supply has to kick in as well. And so what you see is the state then kicks in with the supply of documentation. They may try to make it easier for people to get documents so that they can actually become part of these programs. So it's sort of state top-down, state changes social policies, society responds, doesn't have quite the means to get these policies, state comes in with a documentation campaign. And you're not just seeing this in Brazil. My clear sense is you are seeing this in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Guatemala, where some of these individual neoliberal targeted programs are coming into being. Okay, so the Bolsa Familia is this conditional cash transfer program that's gotten a lot of attention. The basic deal is you show you're very poor, the state provides to the mother a basic pension. So the federal government provides it through a direct cash transfer in exchange for the kids staying in school and meeting some minimal medical requirements like vaccinations, weigh-ins, etc. So this is a federal program through a direct transfer, but the local governments actually administer it. One of the big requirements is that families show documentation. Now, so I'm thinking, how am I going to show that this incentivizes getting documents? I know through social workers, I know from people in the program, I know from a survey that my co-author and I did that a lot of people said they got their documents only because they needed them to register. But I'm trying to do this more systematically based on some evidence from two IDB economists called Wong and Tura. So the notion here is if you want to show or prove that people are getting the documents only to register for these programs, okay, or that's the big incentive. What you want to show is that there's a difference between the population who's in the Bolsa Familia versus not, and that controlling for poverty, controlling for regional, outlying regional areas, that the Bolsa Familia recipients are more likely to have the documents than the control group. I think another way to look at this, so I'm basing this on this article, but I'm going to try to, in Brasilia, do this more systematically this summer, to look at how many late registrations there were in the country before the Bolsa Familia versus late registrations after. So late registrations mean kids getting birth certificates that are over a year old. And I do know that many more late registrations happened after the Bolsa Familia rolled out than before. But I'm trying to make that more systematic. So that's going to be one body of proof. In a survey that I did with Natasha Sugiyama, we went to 3 Northeast locations, and we were trying to probe people's perceptions of the Bolsa Familia. But one question we did ask in that survey is, basically, did you have the wherewithal to apply for this program? Many people said no. One of the things they said was we lacked documents. 17% of our survey said that they got the essential documents, birth certificate, social security card, etc., only because they wanted the Bolsa Familia so badly, and it was a non-negotiable requirement. So this is good, because people should have these things anyway, and this was kind of an incentive to finally get them for themselves and their children. So our survey suggests that a little under 20% of people were incentivized to get documents due to their signing up for the Bolsa. Our interviews with Bolsa Familia coordinators in the Northeast, as well as many social workers, say that they really found that they were under pressure to provide these birth registration campaigns with the rolling out of the Bolsa Familia, because you can't have a government program say, oh, theoretically, wouldn't it be nice to get this, and then find that huge numbers of poor people can't get it because they don't have the requisite documents. So my co-author and I traipsed around the Northeast for 2 summers and realized this was a big problem. I have to say that I have studied Brazil for 20 years, and I have studied social policy for about 10 years of that. Until the summer of 2009, I had no idea what a problem this was. I mean, political scientists just have not identified this as an issue. There's also a program at the other end of the life spectrum called the Continuous Welfare Benefit, Benefício Prestação Continuada. And this has gotten a lot of attention among the social policy crowd. It is a non-contributory pension that goes to people who are extremely poor. You have to make, I think, less than 1/3 of one minimum wage to qualify for this. And if you do qualify, and they really, really scan to make sure that you seriously do qualify, you get one minimum wage. So this makes a huge amount of difference to a poor family. 3 million Brazilians now get this. If you want to talk later about how they actually try to verify your income, I think that's an important discussion, but for later. Another program requirement is that you show documentation. Most of the people who want to apply for this are not in the population that goes and gets registered the day they're born. And so one extreme problem in getting this program up and running is that no one knows who they are. Everyone has the same last name. Some of them have the same first name. They don't know what their birthday is. They don't know when they were born. And all of this, the state has had to take in its own hands and try to figure out for a bunch of 70-year-olds, what their identity is. Nonetheless, this has been another big push in documentation among the elderly crowd. So this summer in Brasilia, I want to make this more systematic also and do that comparison I talked about. Look at people who are in this versus not, equally poor, equally marginalized people. Look at the difference between documents for those in the program and out. And then I also want to do a before and after. Before this program, the BPC, how frequent was it that a 70-year-old would ask for a birth certificate? What is the incidence of that versus after this program? And so that really is research that needs to be done. That's not easy research, by the way. So I'm going to, down in Brasilia, I will have an LBJ student whose statistical capacity exceeds the capabilities that exceed my own, and so we'll see what we do. Okay, so certainly there is a need, a shift with a change in social policy. And interestingly, this is not just in Brazil, but I've been reading in The Economist about India as well, and biometric data and shift towards less patronage-oriented social policy and towards just trying to attack deep poverty through individualized social programs, means tested. They too are talking about identity documents as a prerequisite for that. I mean, and if we think Brazil is a big country with 200 million people, imagine doing it for a country with, are they over 1 billion now? Yeah. Okay, so the demand is there, and you see society seeking, documents. So what actually changes? What does the Brazilian state do to kind of kick in with the facilitation of documents, beginning with the birth certificate? We've seen 3 sorts of responses, and they roughly fall into this picture here. The first is a bunch of legal changes that started under Fernando Henrique Cardoso, so president of Brazil from 1995 till the last day of 2002. One of the I think one of the most important social policies he put through was to declare that everybody gets their first birth certificate absolutely free of charge. And it was his wife that pushed him to do that, because she had been out more kind of in the real world of social policy and had gone out in this program of Solidaridad and realized what a problem this was. Now, you can imagine the cartorios were not very happy about this. We have to provide this free birth certificate for 200 years. We've charged for it. So it ends up that the state, to break the resistance of the cartorios, subsidizes them in different ways. But everybody gets a first free birth certificate. If you can prove that you fall below the poverty line, you also get a second and a third one for free. So that was one important legal change. The other series of legal changes, and this is a kind of incremental, that have been made since the 1990s, is to cut back on the requirement of paternity showing up on a birth certificate. And so it has been kind of an acceptance of the fact that large numbers of kids are not going to have their biological fathers coming forth. And the state has simply decided that rather than insist on something that's not going to happen, they cut back on the requirement. So the paternity issue they have tried to take off the table, because in fact, surveys show that was one of the big stumbling blocks for mothers actually getting their child a birth certificate if the father did not claim. Then there have been an interesting number of public ad campaigns. I'm going to show you a couple of them from YouTube that really try to build societal momentum for these things. And this is very, very nation building, like, you know, the Brazilian flag is all over these public ad campaigns. I saw posters for these in small towns in Bahia. So the ministries, the justice ministry is in charge of this campaign, and actually the ministry that runs the Bolsa Familia has huge numbers of posters and folders and TV ads to try to break through people's resistance, inertia, fear, whatever. I think you'll have a better idea of what the tone of those campaigns are after you see them. My favorite, though, is Ronaldo, the soccer player. Does anyone know what his last name is? I bet nobody knows what Ronaldo's last name is. He comes out, you know, the UNICEF campaign is every child has the right to a name and last name. So he comes out, and you see his last name. It's Ronaldo Nazario. And he, you know, gives the thing about why you need this, why you should get it. They hold your hand. This is how you get it. This is why you want this. And then in another one, they actually address the paternity issue. They have this kind of studly Northeastern guy saying, you know, dads, you really could do your kid a lot of big favor in life if you would assume paternity. But I think it's a very interesting series of trying to inform the public. The other thing is, you know, that's nice and good, but you really need to facilitate this. If you're gonna have state programs that require documents, the state needs to come forward with alternative channels. And so we have seen in the last few years a large number of very interesting ways to bring documentation to the community. Not to say, please get your documents and then find, you know, a way to travel 300 kilometers to the capital city to go to a cartorio. But a real kind of, almost with missionary zeal, effort to bring documentation to the people. One example of this is that the Ministry of Agrarian Reform that has INCRA, Ministry of Agrarian Development, that's the name of it, has buses. They call these little trips caravans of ciudadanía. And they have these air-conditioned buses with computers. And they go out to like places like Roraima, Mato Grosso. And their computers are hooked up to, you know, satellite systems, and they have people who are 70 years old who want to get this non-contributory pension. And they go in the bus, and they come in with their like little baptism record, if they have it. They go from the front of the bus getting their birth certificate, and they walk out with an old age pension. So that's telescoped citizenship, if I ever saw it. Okay, that's a pretty wild, I think, way of doing this. I went out on one of these campaigns that was conducted by actually a municipality. So it's not just federal. Some municipalities are doing this too. And it was called Balcão da Cidadania. So how would you translate that? Citizenship counter? Okay. And it was in the state of Pernambuco, and it was raining, and it was awful, and it was hot, and there was flooding. And these people who were illiterate, many of them were completely illiterate, were coming up with these really ripped up, moldy old documents, if they had any at all. Many of them did not know actually what year they were born, the ones without documents. And these social workers sat there all morning basically trying to figure out what year they might have been born in. The social worker would then go into the church records, if they had the state correct. A huge, huge process. And you might say, oh, why don't they just kind of whip up, you know, a fake name and a birth certificate? But they can't, because these two programs, the BPC and the Bolsa Familia, the societal opinion for them rests on them being non-corrupt and non-fraudulent. And so they really want to insist on very strict documentation. And so, again, like the Caravanas da Cidadania, the balcão, the municipal level balcão. These are taking place all over Brazil now. These are part of this facility that the state is providing. Now, the other alternative channel, which I think is of crucial importance, is to get the notary publics into birth centers. The longer you leave undocumentation of a child, the more likely a child will not get a birth certificate. And so I don't think you have to be a genius to figure out, well, if you had documentation in the hospital or the posto de saúde, and basically try to make it very, very easy, it's more likely to happen. So the state now, the federal government, is subsidizing some cartorios, notary public, if they open up a shop within some of the hospitals. It is 2012. It is high time they did this. This is only starting to happen now, but I think it's an absolute key thing that the federal government has identified and started to do, such that most little kids now, if they are born in any kind of clinic, have the possibility of walking out with a birth certificate. If you look at the number of these programs, though, it's still very small, but I think this is really a way to go. The caravanas da cidadania are kind of cool. However, that's catching the population that 70 years ago should have gotten documented. My experience in Pernambuco with the balcões, that's catching mistakes. That's catching omissions made 45 years ago. This is really trying to look towards the next generation. And so I think this is progress. This just gives you some idea of the flavor of these campaigns. Registering a birth certificate is a right that gives rights. Okay, it is your right, and you need it to get more rights. National mobilization. This is so nation building. Participate and help the Brazilian family grow. The whole Brazilian flag logo here, with holding out the yellow, should not be lost on you there. Oops. And here's this poster is like splattered all over Northeast Brazil. I have a name and a last name. I'm from the Brazilian family. This is a poster from the Pernambuco field work I did. Human rights, balcão da cidadania documents. So, in this one area or one campaign, you could get a birth certificate, late registration, marriage certificate, death certificate, carteira de trabalho. My God, were they pushing these. They were like, you want a birth certificate? Let us also get you a carteira de trabalho, because only with this do you really get under the full protection of Brazilian labor law. You could get legal attendance, and you could get a haircut. Oficina de beleza. The other thing they had at this kind of mobilization suite was nurses, public health nurses, doing very, very basic health, like taking people's blood pressure. This was the state of some documents that were coming in. So one of the problems is not just that people never got documents, but that they lost them or they looked like this. However, all you needed was the number to show to make life a little bit easier for the social worker who took up your cause. But one of the problems in Pernambuco, well, there's the seca, and that's fine because documents do fine and dry, but it rains like crazy in the coastal areas, and there's flooding, and it's just very hard for people who live in huts to keep their documents safe and in good enough shape to be used. One of them came in like that. So I decided after this that maybe I should try to find my own birth certificate, which I hadn't seen in 40 years. I did find it. Luckily, my mother had a copy. It did not look like this, though, right? And this is kind of the general state of affairs. There was a humongous number of people that they attended to that day. And they came in with all sorts of issues. But what was interesting to me was how much these social workers push the ability to have some contact with these people to get them into a better situation overall. Because many of these people just have no contact with the state. And so it's like, okay, there you are. Why don't you get this? Why don't you get that? Why don't you get the next thing? And I think you could really see that the state going to the people is the way this really needs to work. So these little shirts say, "Bow down and see the Thania." This guy's actually a Catholic priest who has made it his mission to go on these campaign drives in not so nice, far-off areas to get people the rights of citizenship. So, conclusion. It really has been, besides the sort of concrete logistical problems, really it was the direction of social policy in Brazil and in many Latin American countries that left huge numbers of informal people, masses, poor, excluded, and undocumented. It's the shift in social policy in a more neoliberal direction towards individual entitlements, targeting, making sure no one falls below a minimum level of basic needs, that has moved social policy towards the point where documentation is seen as relevant to many poor people and where it has been provided. And so this is a kind of interesting twist on T.H. Marshall's notion of the sequence of citizenship. In his view, you first acquire the civic dimensions of citizenship, like a birth certificate, and then you get the social dimensions. So it's political, civic, social. In what we are seeing unfold in Latin America is a twist in that order. First, there is social inclusion through these programs, and then in kind of a backward sequence, you get people who are getting identity documents as a means towards this. So I think this is actually one positive development of many of these programs. You know, I think the Bolsa Familia does a fine job at many things, but it is the Bolsa Familia, and by the time your kids graduate, you don't have it anymore. I think the BPC is good in and of itself. I think it catches extreme poverty. The broader impact of those, though, I think is seen in other areas, and I think this downstream effect of getting people documented has a positive impact that goes far beyond what these two social programs are doing to enhance the welfare of poor Brazilians. Thank you. Now, let me see if I can show you my YouTubes, but I need help. Okay, can you get me on here? Oh, we have it.
Ajude a família Brasil a crescer. Para fazer a certidão de nascimento, vá ao cartório mais próximo ou se informe na prefeitura sobre mutirões. A certidão é grátis.
Pai, você deve tirar a certidão de nascimento do seu filho. Deve ter nome, sobrenome e participar dos programas sociais.
Com a certidão de nascimento, eu tenho acesso a todos os documentos.
Certidão de nascimento é cidadania. Com ela você terá RG, CPF e carteira de trabalho. Certidão de nascimento é um direito que dá direito. É um dever de todo o Brasil.
Governo Federal. Brasil. Um país de todos.
Eu tenho nome de quem não tem. Sem documentos eu não sou ninguém. Eu sou Maria, esse é João. Com certidão de nascimento, sou cidadão. Tirar a certidão é de graça e garante benefícios para o seu filho, como escola, vacinação. É só o pai ou a mãe comparecerem ao cartório mais próximo com algum documento de identidade em mãos, seja da sua cidade ou no município vizinho. Com certidão de nascimento, sou cidadão.
So UNICEF actually is co-sponsoring a lot of this. It's a good thing Joao rhymes with cidadão. So that's the sort of thing that is in the public information campaigns. So,
I guess we should open up to questions.
yes.
An alternative interpretation of all of this, which you've not given any consideration to at all, is that this is just an indirect means of improving the extractive capacity of the state over the medium to long term. As Brazil gets richer, more people will be able to pay taxes, be available. So you give a very rosy view of it. I mean, Lula comes to mind. Do you have any evidence that there's not an ulterior, well, not necessarily an ulterior motive, but a second motivation for
Well,
this?
you know, James Scott, in his book Weapons of the Weak, where he has an interesting section about documents, obviously mentions that, noting that if you can get a handle on people and know where they live and who they are and get them working, you're going to have a better capacity to extract taxes. I do think much of this is technocratic, and it is partly about control and harnessing potential. These people are so far away from paying income tax, though, it's not funny. So they would have to, I don't think it's an immediate goal, and the way Brazilian taxes work is that there are so many value-added tax, such that, you know, a rich industrialist in Sao Paulo buys a Coca-Cola and pays the same amount of tax as some poor person. So Brazilian tax structure is regressive, and I'm not sure that they are thinking in an immediate way about extractive capacity.
Do they have military service in Brazil?
Theoretically, it's compulsory, but I bet you guys didn't go.
When you turn 18, you have to enlist, but not everybody serves. They select just a few.
Is it a lottery-based system or?
It's supposed to be, but it's not.
There are citizens, and then there are citizens. Yeah, and they're of the primera clase, I imagine.
The other thing you say though, I mean, in 20 years Brazil's going to be, if you look at China and India, in 20 years Brazil's going to be very different, and there will be a lot of these people will be paying taxes. I mean, at least if they will have income, that would make them eligible.
Right. No, I
Okay.
think one consequence of this will be, down the road, that these people will pay income tax. To be in the level where you're making 1/3 of a minimum wage is just deep, deep, deep poverty. So I don't think it's an immediate goal. But I agree, I think taxation is part of this story. And it's a story that people with a broader vision like James Scott have recognized, yeah.
Well, related to that, what about more immediately the voting and electoral consequences? So you've seen this, the debate of which you've been a part of,
Mhm.
the Lula and extension of Bolsa Familia, but one of the bigger puzzles has been, have the poor shifted toward him? But it looks like now they're actually extending the franchise to incorporate many more poor people who would naturally be likely to be PT voters. Is that at all a plausible explanation for the vigor with which they've pursued?
I think that's a very good political science question. I have an even more basic question that I cannot get an answer for. Technically, if you don't have a birth certificate, you can't get a voter registration card. So have these people not been voting, or has some patronage politician managed to slip them a voter registration card in exchange for their vote? I don't think that 30% of the potential voting public has not voted just because they didn't have a birth certificate. But in strict legal terms, you shouldn't be voting. You shouldn't have a voter registration card if you don't have these other documents.
I wonder if you can see a total number of votes increasing over time.
Well, turnout has gone up with the Lula syndrome. I don't know what voter registration has done though. But this is some area I definitely have to figure out, right? It's not shocking that the PT would want to do this if they are the recipient of these new votes and these new programs. I would say though, if anything, the push has been more technocratic. It's the ministries that have been pushing this. And do you know in the MDSC, the ministry that runs the Bolsa Familia, hardly anyone is a pitchista. The top technocrats are Tucanos. And I said, why is that? And I mean, I'm talking to the people who got appointed. They basically said, Lula said, this has got to work, right? So we are not appointing activists who don't know how to run an Excel sheet. We are basically getting the top technocrats in this ministry. So a lot of this comes out of that ministry, the Ministry of Justicia, the Department of Human Rights. So, yeah, while it's not antithetical to what would benefit the PT, the actual push for it seems more technocratic to me. Mm-hmm. Yes?
And how about the fact of, in order to get the benefits, especially, elderly or people that are older than 18, voting, you are obliged to vote. Because if you don't vote, you don't get everything locks in the system, so you cannot get a bank loan, you cannot get your check. So in some ways, I see this linked to that old, almost patriarchal society, because until this voting requirement, if you require that, I think it forces people to vote, and that's why, for example, when they say the part of Northeast and North Brazil, the concentration of people who voted there for Lula. So I still see some implications of this whole patriarchal society with the question of you have to vote, otherwise you don't get any.
You have to vote if you're registered to vote. If they don't have you on your radar screen as registered, then you don't have to vote. And also, if you're, I think, over 65 or 70, is it 65 or 70?
I think it's 65.
Okay, you are exempt from obligatory voting even if you have a voter registration card. But I definitely have to figure out what the story is behind not having ID and having a voter card. I think there might be something quite fishy in the background. Yes?
Along those lines, you talked about the sort of menu of services that they're offering and different kinds of registration. Have you seen that voter registration is one of those kinds of services that they're offering along with all these others, or is that something, has it been really sort of concentrated on, birth certificates, marriage
You know, it's more at least in Pernambuco, it's concentrated on these other more civic kinds of things. Now, if they would include the voter ID, and here we'll give you all this stuff, the PT happens to control the government, and by the way, we'll give you a voter registration card, I think that would fuel this hypothesis a little bit more. For some reason, do you know why the voter registration card is not part of this? Is it because it's run out of the tribunal or something? Do you think? So it run out of a different ministry?
I just want to highlight something, if I'm not wrong, in the last election, the particular government asked for, like, if you have just the ID, you didn't need the election ID because you're a citizen. So as long as you have fingers, you can track. So
Okay.
they did it because of political situation.
Okay, so they're backing off on the requirement of showing your voter
Well, no, they
registration.
did that because it was good for them.
Yeah,
Because if you don't have the ID for election, it means that you don't know other things, which means that you'll be a poor person. So, I mean, and they try in a way to take more people for there, to vote for them, you know.
probably more in northeastern and north states than like in Sao Paulo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, in India, India is one case I'm going to have to look more carefully at, and we have Jennifer Bussell, who studies India, is at the LBJ School at Texas. It turns out that rationally minded politicians in India have traded many favors in exchange for getting people voter ID cards. So, you know, traded grain, traded bricks and mortar kind of thing, and in the meantime, deliver over voter ID cards, and then guess who these people vote for. So I think I have to look a little bit more into this logic, but I have been actually confused about some of the even baseline logistics of it.
I mean, the flip side of the political story, though, is not, I'm trying to build a clientele, I'm trying to, you know, hey, the PT is getting you these citizenship forms or documents so that you can then get all these benefits. The flip side is what you started with. Clientelism depended on their absence. And who were they voting for before? All they have to do is break down clientelism, and they win. So it could be self-serving, but also public-serving, simply by going at it from the other side.
Right, I mean, that is the flip side, right? The PT, what clientelism depends on is political discretion. Here are these federal monies. You are poor. You don't have any regular bureaucratic benefit. I have discretion. You need me here. Once you get into play regular sources of income that are not tappable through political intervention, and I think the Bolsa Familia is pretty darn clean, then in a way, if you're a politician, you're taking yourself out of the game a bit, right? So the provision, especially for a party out of power, the provision of these bureaucratic programs means that they're losing the discretion over areas. Now, a cynic could say, well, they could have these nice social programs and also play their own political games. So that is also possible, but I think the more you build in bureaucratic entitlements over the long run, the less room there is for kind of political machinations. In India, by the way, I've heard that the real patronage politicians do not like the identity document campaign. They do not like the conditional cash transfers because that takes away their ability to wheel and deal and to keep people really vulnerable. Yes?
So it seems like there's a couple of different rationales that you talked about now for this. That is it really about increasing documentation, or is that just something that, okay, well, now we have these programs, and in order to have these programs, we need to have documentation, or is it about embarrassment for not knowing who's in the country, or embarrassment about poverty, right? That these are unacceptable things, right? In a modern country, a middle-income country, this is unacceptable. We need to fix these problems. So those were two, and then this third now, perhaps, that these programs were really less about actual fighting the poverty than breaking the clientelism that was kind of behind the political system. So I wonder if you have thoughts about which of those more operative.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair criticism. It basically, there's a lack of a central focus here. I think the documents is a reflection of the social policy, and it is merely kind of a downstream effect. And an effect that we see in many places where social policy is changing. So then your question is social policy changing because of humanitarian concerns, technocratic concerns, or political concerns? And do I hear you saying that should be the bulk of the analysis, and this is just should be an analysis?
I just didn't know it. I'm coming into this from a very different place, where China, where they know everything about you, but they don't give you that much. So that there's an identity, and there's information about your identity without the type of social programs at the individual level. And so it's interesting to see kind of the opposite story, and so I think I'm just trying to wrap my head around.
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of motives going into the shift in social policy. One is that Latin America doesn't have much money in the mid-1990s, and these programs are very cost effective. The Bolsa Familia is like 1/60th the amount that they pay in pensions every year. So, you know, it's been established to be very poverty alleviating, very popular, and at not much money. Okay, so there's definitely an economic motivation, and this is why, say, a country like Chile went to a targeted social policy. It saves money and it gets the job done. And so beyond that technical rationale, I think there's a diffusion element here. Everybody's doing it, right? The World Bank likes you if you do it. So I think there's economic, technical rationale. Also, this is politically very popular. So there's a political rationale if you're the president to put through these programs. And most presidents who have gotten votes for it, because most people are poor. And if you pick up their vote, good for you. I really seriously believe that the kind of Jose Serra, Lucia Modesto, she's the head of the Bolsa Familia, they're part of an epistemological community, an epistemic community that just thinks this level of poverty in a middle income country is not acceptable. I don't even think they're instrumental about it. I don't think they think that, you know, therefore these people don't pay taxes, therefore their political capital can't be harnessed. The word Jose Serra uses is embarrassing. And this takes you out of embarrassment a lot faster than many policies do. So yeah, the documentation aspect is a downstream aspect. They are not first and foremost interested in documentation. It just happens to be one effect of it. Yes?
You know, in my view, until the cartórios disappear,
I know.
because this cannot become really technocratic, as you mentioned, because this is a legacy from colonial times, and it is extremely traumatic for people who are educated to try to get their documents. In my case, for example, my husband lived in Brazil for over 4 years, and we decided to get married in July, you know, so go to a vacation in Brazil. And by the time you go to a cartório and you have to get a document that, all sorts of documents, by the time and they have a period that expires. By the time you complete the last document, the first one has expired, so you have to start all over again.
Oh, I
So,
know.
and you have to pay for this. And people who own cartórios are extremely rich. A lot of times they are not well educated in many places. So I think this is going to be it is a stumbling block.
Absolutely, it's a stumbling block. Well, I had my own little experience with cartorials because I tried to get a driver's license when I lived there. And sometimes I use my middle name and sometimes I don't. I'm obviously the same person. My picture is there and one says Wendy Hunter and one says Wendy Ann Hunter. I was born on the same day. They said, well, you could be two different people because one is this name and one is that name. So then I had to get 3 times more documents. Meanwhile, I'm like driving illegally in Sao Paulo because I can't get a driver's license.
For even at the university, they said, I have 2 names and 2 true names. So they said, you have to, like, get everything, otherwise you can be somebody else. And I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
No.
frustrating because.
And you know, what's interesting is I did a little search on the cartorials. So Para, which is a huge state, it has one one municipality, Altamira, which is like the size of Ohio or something. It's huge. 3 cartorials. They are all owned by families going back like 200 years. Can you imagine the lock on them? So when I talked to the people in the ministry about this, they said exactly that. They said one of the big obstacles are the notary publics. And when Fernando Henrique made the first birth certificate free, and then he cut out their ability to charge extra for late registration. Late registration means if you're over a year old. They used to charge an enormous amount to get a kid a birth certificate if it was over 1. He basically, through a decree, said they couldn't do that. They came back with fierce resistance. They lobbied in the Congress. So they have a lot of power, which is why the Brazilian state has had to give them subsidies and beg them to go into the hospitals and give them money to go into the hospitals. They are one of the big stumbling blocks. So you see kind of, I mean, you really see here technocratic Brazil up against historical institutionalism. These institutions that have come out of history and have an independent life of their own and are dysfunctional, but nonetheless have this vested power and authority and interest. And then the worst, you know, judges would have to approve new cartorials. So you can only imagine the game that's being played between the existing cartorials and the judges that would have to grant new ones. But in The Economist, if you keep your eye on this, this is an emerging topic you will see in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh.
Well, we laugh and we think we could be 2 different people. But where I'm working partly through interpreting and answering all these questions, we run into the fact that all the Somalis who have come, someone decided somewhere they're all born on 1/1 of a certain year.
Oh, yeah.
They name them after each other. They don't always specify which of the 5 wives or whatever. And so we try, and even in the Spanish-speaking community, we have the same name, in the same city, born on the same date, and it's very confusing every time they go to the same clinic to get the right records.
I know. The same name is a problem. João Silva must be the most common name in northeastern Brazil, especially if you can't identify the year you were born. So this Indian software entrepreneur has a retinal scan that he's developed. So it's the new thing is biometric data. And evidently none of us have, this is even better than fingerprinting, the same retina. And so to get over the fact that every other Indian has the same name and is illiterate and was born on 1/1/1 and doesn't know what, you know, they are using this retinal scan as kind of the basis for a whole new identification towards social programs.
Well, if you want to become a citizen, then you have to do the biometrics.
You do.
Whole body. And if, for example, one of my clients was burned, so I changed it, so it held everything up because she had to go right back from all of it to prove that she really was the same person.
What do you know? What do you know?
But still, we have people getting these documents out of fear. They panic, so they will not go to the hospital, they will not go to the doctor, their friends will help them through the birth in the apartment. And then trying to get documents.
Yeah. One of the reasons why in Bolivia and Ecuador, they are having a hard time getting the birth campaign underway is still a large percentage of births are not in any sort of formal clinic. And the minute you have that, the harder it is to get the birth certificate. Exactly.
So how is it? Let me curious. If I was a British-Columbian child, I would get my certificate later on, and my parents didn't. If their parents didn't, where's the cutoff here?
It depends on how hard your social worker wants to work and how much they want to kind of play fast and loose with the rules. Luckily, most people were baptized, and so they are going into baptismal records. I think without that, though, I don't know how they would be doing this. But they use the church a lot, and evidently the church has kept pretty good records, even in these really poor places. And so people walk in with their birth certificate. And even the first place, I mean, their baptismal record, even if they don't have it, more times than not, they don't have it, the social worker will do a search of the, I guess you call them parishes, in that state, if they have any notion what year they were born in and what section of the state. And so that really has facilitated this.
Great, well,
Thank you for
very
your
much.
stimulating questions.
And first, I forgot to say a thank you to Erica Cohen also for making all of this happen at the Center for Latin American Studies. But most important, of course, thank you to Wendy Hunter for coming in.